kick it off to you.
All righty.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the May Steam Day. Today we're learning basically all about the ins and outs of podcasting. That's with Streamlabs and Audacity, and I guess just how you even start a podcast. I think that's the most important question of today's Steam Day. So I'm gonna go ahead and kick it off to Dennis, let him introduce himself and take it away.
All righty. So, yeah, I'd like to introduce myself. So, my name is Dennis Robinson, though on the internet I am referred to as the world's most okayest DM for the podcast that we're on. I've been podcasting for over 8 years now. It's been almost 8.5 years because this year is flying by pretty quick. The podcast that I do, which is definitely not for all audiences, is called Botched, a D&D podcast. And at that point, I would normally give the elevator pitch, but I'll cover that a little bit later in this particular lesson. And I'm a consultant in my normal day job, but I actually do a lot of voiceover work, narration, podcasting, and video work as far as my normal job goes. And I will also talk about how sort of starting a podcast 8.5 years ago helped me develop skills that then got me into different jobs that I never would have gotten otherwise. And how I started doing, audiobooks, narrations for different podcasts and things like that. And then I also do narration of work for commercials for like Ford, Toyota, Lexus, Acura, Walmart, Google, all kinds of stuff. So yeah, so podcasting can actually lead into a lot of stuff, even if you are not going to go to college specifically for something related to podcasting. Even if you do it as like sort of a side passion project, those skills can turn into something that you can use later on in life. So my my personal story I wanted to share real quick is that I have an insanely eclectic work history. If you look at my resume, nothing makes any sense in terms of like how does any of this fit together? How does it go from point A to point B to point C? None of that makes any sense. But one of the things I said before, I started podcasting in about 2016, and we taught ourselves how to do everything from scratch. We used to listen to a D&D podcast called Nerd Poker. And then Nerd Poker went off the air because it's a bunch of stand-up comedians, so they all got busy with their lives and did other things. So we were sitting there playing D&D one night, and we're like, hey, we're pretty ridiculous. We think this might be pretty funny. Let's start a podcast. So we bought some very basic equipment. We bought a Blue Yeti mic, which again, equipment I'll cover a little bit later. And we just stuck it in the middle of the table and recorded ourselves just to get an idea of what the feel of the show would be. And then we gave that audio unedited to friends of ours to see, is this something, cleaned up? Would it be something you'd actually listen to? And everybody came back with yes, absolutely. So we invested the time into getting more equipment, although our equipment we found in a barn. Like our one friend, his employer had a bunch of music equipment in a barn. So we just piecemealed everything together. I got moving blankets from the U-Haul, the used stuff to cover up the windows and the doors. And literally we just piecemealed the whole thing together. We bought some super cheap microphones and a very cheap soundboard and just basically did it from scratch, from the ground up. And then over 8 years, we've built it up into what it is now, where the equipment is on par with like ESPN or Joe Rogan, stuff like that. But again, we started off very simply, and then we've just progressed over time. The podcasting skills, my first job that I was actually interested in that stuff, which I didn't apply for anything related to podcasting, but I went in the interview and I mentioned in my resume that I podcast. And that caught their interest because that job was interested in pursuing something like that. So I ended up getting the job over other candidates because I had that audio editing and podcasting background. And then when I went to my current company, again, because I have all this podcasting experience, they were very interested in starting their own sort of selling podcasting to clients as a job. So they were like, oh, we need somebody who has a bunch of years experience doing this stuff, especially, building stuff from the ground up, scratch and all that jazz. So again, I got that job. So now I actually run their podcasting department in the 3 offices that we have. And I also run their voiceover and their narration and stuff like that. So I say all this stuff just to say that the skills that you learn through podcasting can actually carry over to real world jobs, even if it's not specific for podcasting, but makes you a more attractive candidate, which I know right now you're probably not super worried about, but I'm just sort of giving you the down the road sort of view of things. I will say this as a life warning, though. Uh, if you start your own podcast right now, I would not expect that to be your sole source of revenue, to be a full-time job or anything like that. Unless you are a secret celebrity that I do not know about. I mean, maybe you are, I don't know. But if you aren't, it's very hard to generate revenue right off the bat from a podcast. And even if you do start a podcast and you start to build it up over time, there are ways, which we'll talk about, that you can generate little bits of revenue here and there. But even then, that's not enough to make like a full-on career. You can go to college to study in different backgrounds that would lead to podcasting and things like that. But the type of careers that you'll get are a little bit different from like just starting your own podcast. You'll be a producer on an already existing podcast, or an audio editor, or things like that. There are different jobs and roles. But it wouldn't be like, hey, we want a podcast. How about you just make your own podcast, then we'll pay you to do it. Most of the time, the professional careers that are looking to hire somebody, that's not what they're looking for. They're looking more for the behind the scenes sort of people. So that's just an idea behind that. But also keep in mind that if you want to start a podcast, it's easy. But if you want it to sort of last and build over time, it is a ton of work, which we will talk about here in a little bit. And so to give you a little idea of the breakdown of what we're going to go into here, I'm going to go over sort of an introduction to podcasting, planning a podcast, recording a podcast, editing a podcast, and then releasing a podcast. That'll be the first sort of part of this lesson. And then we'll move over into video stuff as well, because you can also do video as part of a podcast, but you don't have to. But I want to cover both, just, to give them their fair shake. As far as questions go, after each section, I'll open the floor. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. I'll answer all of them. I do have an activity planned for the first part and for the second part. So we'll, break off and let you guys work on that. And then we'll come back together after like maybe 10, 15 minutes, something like that. If it needs to be faster, Micah could just yell at me, or, somebody else at one of the schools, and we'll go from there. But yeah, so let's get into an introduction to podcasting.
Dennis, you want me to go ahead and say speed it up?
Do what now?
You want me to go ahead and say speed it up? Speed it up, old man?
Sure. Yeah. You just yell at me to speed it up, old man. Yeah. I especially feel old today, so that definitely fits. So you want to start a podcast. So there's a thing that we say in podcasting, and everybody I know in podcasting says the same thing. Everybody has a podcast, which is kind of true. It feels like everybody does have a podcast. There are a million podcasts out there. For funsies, if you were to look up D&D podcasts or comic book podcasts, you will find just a gigantic list of different podcasts to listen to. There's so many out there. Now, obviously, the quality difference is vast between, all the podcasts and whatnot, and the feel and the style and all that jazz. But there's so many podcasts out there that if you want to start a podcast and actually make it into something that a lot of people listen to, you sort of have to differentiate it a little bit. But if you're just doing it because you're passionate about it and you just want to have fun with it, that's totally cool too. And there's definitely space for that in the arena of podcasting and all that jazz. But just so you know, there's so many podcasts out there because it is very easy to get into podcasting. You don't have to have the greatest equipment in the world to start a podcast. You can literally just start it up on your phone and go from there, or your iPad, I believe, or your laptop. And we'll talk about this in a little bit, the quality difference is vast as opposed to, when you start getting into different levels of equipment and whatnot. So what is podcast? Now, I'm sure all of you already know what a podcast is, but, an audio program or video in some instances of some sort. And there are different types of podcasts, all kinds of different types, and we'll get into that in a little bit as well. But that's essentially what it is. It's just a program, usually audio, especially if you're going to put it out on Spotify or iTunes, things like that. But you can also do video related as well, which is, YouTube, Twitch, things like that. As I've mentioned a few times, and I will mention many times in the future of this lesson, podcasting requires a ton of planning. I mean, I guess requires isn't the right word, because you don't have to do a ton of planning, but you will have a lot of pitfalls and speed bumps and have a lot of trouble if you don't plan it out all the way. And I'm going to help you with that because I'm going to give you all the things to think about, which will be part of this first activity as well. So keep that in mind. So let's talk about planning a podcast. So there are many things to consider and plan for when you actually want to start a podcast. And when I got my last job, part of the interview process was teaching the interviewer how to do something. And most of the time people were like, "Oh, here's a program or here's this or that." I went with, "So you want to start a podcast?" and talk to her about, planning a podcast out, setting all this stuff up, everything we're about to go into. And that section of the interview was only supposed to be 5 minutes. And she and I ended up talking for about 25, 30 minutes about planning out this podcast that she actually kind of wanted to start. So it ended up working out. But so I just say that to say planning, there's a lot of planning involved. So as I said, anyone can make a podcast, but it requires a lot of planning and work for it to be a good podcast. So first things first, what is your podcast going to be about? You have to figure out the subject matter of your podcast. Is it a D&D podcast? Is it a news-related podcast? Is it a debate podcast? Is it an audio drama podcast? Are you just recapping the news? It could be anything you want it to be, but you have to figure out, okay, what is the subject matter of the podcast? That should be first and foremost. What is this podcast going to be about? So then the next thing you need to talk or think about is, what type of podcast is this going to be? And there are a number of different types. So the first is a monologue podcast. A lot of times when you watch YouTube essays, for instance, it's just one person talking at the screen. I would consider that a monologue podcast. They're not interviewing anybody. They're not rehashing the news or anything like that. They're just one person sort of giving their thoughts, opinions, feelings, all that jazz into the camera or just into the microphone. That is a monologue podcast. It is both maybe the most straightforward and also one of the more challenging ones, because you have to fill space and be engaging by yourself and keep a listener's attention for however long your podcast goes, for the entirety, all by yourself with no other help. It can be kind of difficult, especially when you're first starting out. Then you have like a duo or a trio. And again, this is similar to the monologue, but you just have a group of people talking. This isn't an interview or a round table or anything like that until you start to get into like 4 people. But again, it's similar to the monologue. You just have a couple more people involved. Then you have an interview podcast. Most famous of all the interview podcasts, I would think, is Joe Rogan. That's an interview podcast. It's Joe Rogan, and he interviews 1 or 2 other people. And with interview podcasts, you could have yourself and 1 or 2 other hosts interviewing a person or a group of people. There's different, all the types of podcasts are flexible in terms of, the ins and outs. The basic fundamentals are the same, but the details can get a little malleable, I suppose. So an interview podcast is that. Now that can be very interesting. It can be very difficult. It depends. You have to generate questions ahead of time and think up in something that would be interesting for a listener to be listening to and learn about and things like that. And then we have repurposed content. So repurposed content is one I find that a lot of people get confused about. So repurposed content is a sort of like, you take one form of media and you're turning it into a podcast. So let's say, for instance, at my job, one of the repurposed content podcasts we did was, there was a newsletter. It's just a written newsletter with images and whatnot, but they wanted to turn it into a podcast. Well, that is repurposed content. Even though it's a monologue, technically, we are taking the information from one thing and just repurposing it into a totally different, form of consumption, audio or video in some instances, whatever. This is just taking something that already exists and making it something else, just so that it gets out there in a more easily digestible way or more interesting way. Then you have a roundtable podcast. These are difficult because of podcasting etiquette in terms of trying not to talk over each other. The reason for that is, if you're all talking over one another, especially if you're on the same soundboard and you're only on one track with no differentiation, that means all the audio is just jumbled together and you can't sift it apart. So a roundtable podcast is a group of people discussing a topic. For instance, we used to do roundtable podcasts on different movies. The last one that we did for the podcasting network that we used to be on, which was kind of infamous, was we did a Star Wars The Last Jedi podcast, which ended up being longer than the movie it was itself. That's how much we talked. And we just talked and talked and talked and talked and talked. But that was a round table in terms of a group of people all discussing one topic or multiple topics and just going back and forth. And then the last one I want to talk about is the story or audio drama. This one is an interesting one because it's very different from the others. This one is you're trying to tell a story or you're trying to do an audio drama, so it involves like acting or narrating stories, things like that. So it's very different from the other ones. And usually this is the one that requires the most editing because you'll probably have sound effects and more music and more characters, especially if it's a full-on audio drama that has like a full cast of characters. And for those of you who like to do theater stuff, this is a really fun one to do. It's just that it would be probably an audio only, or you could do video as well. But usually with audio dramas, because there's so many characters, most of the time that's audio only, just because it's so much to try and keep track of with all the different cameras and everything else, that one is usually that. So those are the different types of podcasts. So again, you just have to figure out, okay, I've got my subject matter. Now, how do I want to tell this particular podcast? Next question is, who is involved in this podcast? Are you doing everything yourself? Do you have a group of people that you're splitting these jobs up with? Even if you're doing a monologue podcast, maybe you're not going to be doing the editing. Maybe you want somebody to be doing the social media. Maybe you have a producer, like Joe Rogan has Jamie in the background, who's, monitoring the lines, making sure the audio is working, making sure everybody's talking into the microphone the right way, different things. So there are different jobs related to a podcast. So you have to decide, am I doing everything myself or am I going to have a group of people? For our podcast, for instance, we have 4 members. I am the host of the podcast. I write the episodes, and then I also edit the episodes. Other people do the social media work. Other people make video content that we release on like TikTok or YouTube that's related to the episodes. And then the other guy's just funny on the show all the time. So it just depends. You'll have to plan that out yourself and figure out how you want to set this whole thing up. The next thing you want to think about is your release schedule. So what is a release schedule? It's right there in the name. It's how often do you want to release the podcast? Is this going to come out every day? There's a lot of news podcasts where every single day there is a podcast episode that comes out. Normally, those are the ones that require the least amount of editing because they are a daily podcast. You also have a weekly podcast. Our podcast is that where it just comes out roughly the same day every week, every single week. Are you going to do a bi-weekly every other week or a monthly or a quarterly? So there are pros and cons to doing each one of these, and it really depends on the style of podcast that you're going with. But I will say one of the big cons is sort of tied to one of the most important things about podcasting. There's 2 main factors to consider if you want your podcast to be good. 1, how is your audio quality? And then 2, in this instance, would be, is it consistent? So, for instance, my show, we've released every single week for 8.5 years. We've never missed a week in 8.5 years. And I'm very, very specific to not let that happen. Like, even if there's like a technical glitch or something, one way or another, there's an episode coming out on the week. Even if it's something else that we just have to put in to fill time, something comes out every single week because, and why this is important, people love habits. So when you have a podcast, you start to listen, you're like, oh, Monday podcast is coming on. I got to listen to this episode. If it's not there, people might wait around for a couple of days. But if your podcast isn't there for weeks at a time, or months at a time, or years at a time, people will forget about it and move on to something else. Sometimes they'll come back, but sometimes they won't. So it's one of those things where if you want to have a consistent podcast and build up an audience or a listener base over time, consistency is key because people want to have that pattern of being able to listen to it week after week after week, or day after day, again, however you want to do it. The next question, which is one of the more tedious ones, is how much editing is going to be involved in your podcast? So is your podcast going to be what we call straight to tape, which means you record it and then you post it? There's nothing else in it. It's just straight to tape, no editing. Is there going to be some minor editing? Are you going to put an intro, an outro, some music? Is it going to be a little bit more where you're taking out the ums, the tongue clicks, the you knows, the likes, things like that? Is it going to be an audio drama? In which case you're going to have a ton of editing because again, you want to remove all the unnecessary noises, the downtime, you're going to add lots of music and sound effects and all that stuff. We're talking, you could be doing a 1 hour podcast, but it could take you upwards of 6, 8, 10 hours of editing for that episode. Just depends. Are you going to be doing the editing? Like, are you going to learn those skills yourself and do that? Or are you going to have somebody else on your team do it? Or are you going to pay somebody to do it? Excuse me. So, for instance, there are websites and services where you can hire somebody to do that kind of thing. I know Fiverr is one of those programs where they'll have people just waiting in the wings and they'll be like, hey, this is my rate. And you give them the audio, you tell them what you want, how you want it, and they send it back after a certain amount of time that you would decide between each other. Oh. And then I will say with the editing, the one comment that I get a lot from people at work when it comes to starting to learn how to edit is that it's very, very tedious. And I won't lie, it is very tedious to learn to edit. Some people do enjoy it, and I have a lot of fun with it, but it is one of the more tedious things and very time consuming. But again, it's a skill that once you learn can be very useful for other things moving forward. Before I move over to the next part, are there any questions? Does anybody want some more information on anything? Is there anything that maybe you would like covered a little bit more that I didn't already? As I choke. Nope. Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about is recording a podcast. So the first thing you need to think about is what are you going to be using to record? What is your budget? Is this super low budget? Do you have like an infinite amount of money? Did you turn on the money cheat, basically? These are all things that you need to think about. For instance, if you have a low budget, you're mostly going to be looking at a USB mic. It's just a microphone that plugs into the computer and you record directly from the microphone to the computer. For instance, and I will show you an example here, because I don't have one in this studio. Share with you. This is the most common USB microphone. It's a Blue Yeti. These are really nice because they're pretty cheap. They're under $100 most of the time. The other one is a Snowball, which is, I believe, this one here. These are both pretty cheap, pretty easy to use. However, with these microphones, you usually need a specific environment in which to use it. So what do I mean by that? At work, we do voiceover and we open it up to all the employees. So if anybody wants to get their feet wet in doing voiceover, we recommend that they get a microphone, and most of the time they get a Blue Yeti. The issue is if you put the Blue Yeti in just a normal room, it will have a lot of echo and noise and other things. So it'll pick up everything that's in the surrounding area. So you have to have a very specific environment for it to sound really good. So that's where you can run into some issues with that. If you have a low budget, you can start to invest in what are called condenser microphones. So for instance, I have one here. This is the first microphone that we actually used for the show after the Blue Yeti. And these are microphones where you speak into the end here and you'll plug an XLR cable, is what they're called, into the back of it. And then you plug that into a soundboard. Soundboard is just a little box with knobs and different levels that you can adjust. So each person can be adjusted to their optimal levels. Soundboard is where you really start to get into being able to adjust things for each individual person, especially if you have multiple people all in the same room. Soundboards are great because everybody's going to have different voice, different vocals, all kinds of different stuff. So soundboards are great for differentiating each person and setting everything up. So, and then that will hook up into the computer. So all the different microphones are sort of being coalesced together into a USB cord, which goes into the computer. And with that, even though it's a little bit more expensive, and the sound quality is better, it still needs a better environment because it's going to be picking up different things like echoes and room noise and other things like that. And then lastly, you have a higher budget, which is what I'm recording on right now. This is called a Heil PR40. And so I apologize for the noise that this is about to make, but I wanted to illustrate what it looks like. So this microphone, for instance, looks like it has stuff all around it, and then it has a thing on top. With this microphone, if I were to talk into the sides of it, you won't hear, it won't sound very good because this isn't actually for picking up your voice. This particular microphone, what it does is you speak into this end right here. This on the side is actually pulling in all the ambient noise that's coming in. So if there's a fan running or something else that's humming in the background, it will filter into this and then it'll filter out of the audio so it won't be so noticeable. This allows us to have like air conditioners running or fans running in case this room gets insanely hot. This little guy here this is what's called a pop filter. So it's like a little guy you put on the top. It helps deal with plosives, which is anything with a P word can like hit the microphone and make it peak really high. Another form of a pop filter is this guy here. So basically you would attach it to the desk, the arm that we have here, whatever, and it goes in front of your microphone. And again, the it hits this filter and then it doesn't hit your microphone. So it doesn't peak on the microphone itself. And then this microphone is attached to an XLR cable. In our instance, these are filled with gold, actually. They have gold wiring because it conducts sound better for whatever reason. I do not understand all the ins and outs and whys of things work better. I just know that they do. And then all this is attached to a boom arm. So that way it doesn't have to be on the table, doesn't have to be latched onto the table. It's just sort of setting on the table. And then our microphone is connected to what's called a cloud lifter, which will amplify your audio further. And then that goes into the soundboard, which in our instance is a Rodecaster. And I'll show you a picture real quick because these are really easy to use and really fantastic soundboards. They're just very expensive. Probably because they are so easy to use. This guy here. So in the back is where you'll plug in your microphones, headphones, things like that. And then each of these, I don't even know what you want to call them, the little levers or whatever. This is to adjust levels. So if somebody talks a little louder than somebody else does, you can adjust it. You can turn on the line, mute the line. You can bring in audio from a phone. So if you are somebody who is an interview podcast and you're calling somebody or having somebody come in, you can have your phone audio go into the board and then it automatically goes into the computer. You could have sound effects. So if you wanted to have like a wacky radio show, with all kinds of, weird sound effects, you could program different sound effects to these colored buttons. And then when you hit the button, boom, the sound effect goes through the soundboard into the computer. And then whoever's on the podcast can hear it. And then whoever's wherever it's being recorded will also pick that up. And so, yeah, so this soundboard is fantastic. It's amazing. I thoroughly recommend it, but it is very pricey. It's definitely on the high end after you've been doing this for a while and if you've decided this is something I want to do or pursue. Stop the sharing on that. So that's sort of the high end as far as the recording goes. Now, the thing about the high end recording, your audio quality is going to be way better, but also your environment doesn't have to be the best environment. You can be a little bit more lax with it. You should still take some precautions with your environment, but you don't have to be as stringent as you do with the lower stuff. So I mentioned previously, as far as our show goes, building up equipment over time. We bought a Yeti mic to test, and then we bought, these condenser mics, the cords, the little soundboard, and then over time we just built it up. And over years, we upgraded to a little bit better mics, and then a little bit better mics, and then to these mics, and better cables, better soundboard, things like that. And the way we did that, and we'll talk about it in a little bit later, is we have a Patreon, and we would get ad revenue from the people listening to the episodes. So there's different ways to generate revenue as far as the podcast goes that then lets you basically enhance the quality of your podcast so then more people can listen to it and enjoy it and maybe not get turned off by the sound quality. I know, talking to a few other professionals, a lot of people have said if you don't catch somebody in the first like 10 minutes of a podcast, you're probably not ever going to catch them. So if your audio quality is not very good, they'll listen to those first 10 minutes and decide it's not for me, move on to the next. Or if the content's not engaging for the first 10 minutes, they'll decide this isn't for me, move on to the next. So it's one of those things. So for us, we built it up over time. It was just stuff in a barn, and now it's stuff on par with ESPN and Joe Rogan. And at work, I've actually been tasked multiple times with building sound studios and recording setups at offices for professional voiceover work. So I have quite a bit of experience just sort of building stuff from the ground up and going off of different budgets in terms of knowing, what's cheap, what's expensive, things like that. The next thing to think about is where will you be recording? So where you record makes a huge difference, and this is why. So obviously you don't want to record in a space that has a ton of noise going on. Like there's an industrial air conditioner right next to the microphone, or, it's right next to the window on a super busy street that's constant construction noises and cars and all that stuff, because it will be in your audio and people will hear that and it'll make them crazy. In a big empty rectangular room, you'll have a lot of echo. And the reason for that is that when you talk, it bounces around the room and then goes back into the microphone. That's how you get that echo. So where is a good place to record? Well, the first thing you could do is clutter up a room. Like if you have a room with lots of couches and pictures and just stuff in the room, it will help sort of slow down the sound waves and lessen a bit of that echo. That's like the bare basic. The next one up from that, I would say, is better, is in a car in a garage. So for whatever reason, inside of a car, the way that they're built and insulated, when you talk, there's not as much echo. So it's not the most comfortable because, again, you're either holding your microphone or doing whatever it is, your laptop, and having all that stuff inside your car. But if you have a garage where it's not super, super loud outside of your house and you can be in the car, you can record, and that's a really good spot to record as well. The last place, which is the most common place I've seen people use, is a closet. And so the reason for that is it's filled with stuff. You have a bunch of clothes in there. When your sound waves leave your mouth, they hit the clothes and then just sort of have a lot of trouble going through them, muffles them down. And then by the time they hit a wall and try to bounce back, it's then going through a bunch of clothes again. So it has almost no echo. If you go sit in a closet right now that has a bunch of clothes, you'll notice that when you talk, your voice doesn't really go anywhere. It just sort of dies. It just goes out and just drops right down. Whereas go into a big rectangular room and talk, you'll notice, especially in a basement where there's not a whole lot of stuff, it'll bounce around and you'll hear that echo. So at work, when people buy the Yetis, we always say, if you're going to buy a Yeti, the best place for you to record is in the closet, because that is where you're going to get the most bang for your buck in terms of it's the cheapest, it's the easiest to set up, and it'll give you the best sound quality for, the device that you're using. There are some ways to improve the places that you record. So the first thing would be foam. I don't have any down off of the walls right now, but let me see here. Up here. So sorry for the shine, but so this is foam that's all over our ceiling. It used to be when we built our studios that this foam would be all over the walls. And it does make a big, big difference. And there are different types of foam. Like you can get like this egg carton foam that's like in different packing materials. That works. It's not the best, but hey, better than nothing. And then there's this stuff which is specific for sort of audio quality types of things. This type of foam is usually the next thing up. And again, it can get kind of pricey. The last one I recommend are what are called sound panels. Now there's some on the wall back here behind me. This one is more of a professional one. These are the ones that I built myself. So the professional one that's back here, I'll turn the camera a little bit. So these guys, the way these work, you put these on the wall And like with the closet, the sound waves go in and then they just sort of die. They're not really going to be able to bounce off the wall and come back out because this is essentially filled with foam or cloth or other different materials. So the sound waves can't get through. These sound panels are typically like $200 a panel, something like that. Whereas, these panels that I built myself, they're pretty easy to make. They could be a little tedious. Essentially, the most expensive thing you're going to buy is the wood frame, and then you have to cut it and put that together. And then the cloth that goes around it, I just got from Joann Fabrics. I just picked cloth that I thought would look cool. But I mean, if you have a themed podcast and you want to have sound panels related to your theme, like, I don't know, like a Marvel podcast or something, I'm sure there's some cloth out there that you can use. If you just want to use a towel, that works, a solid color, whatever. But essentially, these I built for maybe $10 or $20 a piece. And essentially, the innards of this, I went to different hotels and I said, hey, can I just have your old sheets that you don't want anymore? And they have mountains of sheets that they don't want to use, that they're just like, well, we can't use these anymore. We can't use them for anything. They don't throw them away. So they'll just give you garbage bags of sheets for free. And then you cut them up, you sew them together, and you make them into like a thickish sort of padding. And then you sew that into the back of, your little whatever shape you decide to make it, and then cover it up and then put them on the walls. And yeah, it's time consuming, but you can build it yourself, or you could build them and sell them. And you build it for 10, 20 bucks and they're worth $200 and they sound great. The moment we put these down here in this room, and I just sat them up against the wall, didn't even hang them yet. Immediately you walk in this room and the sound just falls off a cliff, just doesn't go anywhere. There's no echo whatsoever in this room, which makes for really, really good audio quality. And if you go to a professional studio, like I don't know if any of you are familiar with Hanover, PA, but there is a professional studio that you can pay to use. And in that room, you will see a lot of sound panels and also a little bit of foam. Usually their ceiling is foam and then the sides are the sound panels. So professional studios use it. You can make them even look so that they're decorative, so that they blend into the background walls. So you can have them in your bedroom or your living room or wherever you want to record, and they won't even be noticeable depending on whatever patterns that you choose, even if it's like a single color that's the same color as your walls. But again, it's just another thing you can do to improve the quality of things and also sort of add a skill to your toolbox. Yeah. And then let's see here. So like I said, I've built now 4 studios for my own use, and each studio has gotten more elaborate, more complicated. And then at work, I've built 3 different size studios as well. So I've been doing this for a little bit. And again, you could do it on a shoestring budget, or you could do it on a super, you have money to burn kind of a budget. Are there any questions about that? And if anybody wants to know how to build one of these, feel free to let me know or let Micah know, and I'll be happy to share with you, where I got my stuff from. Basically, I YouTube everything, look up do it yourself. How do I build these sound panels? And looked up what's the right ones, what's the best way to do it and all that jazz. So if anybody wants to know how to do it, let me know. I'm more happy to share that information with you as well. The next thing I wanted to talk about was, so how are you going to build an audience? So one of the hardest things about podcasting is building an audience. And what they always tell people who are starting out, when you release an episode, don't expect to have like 100 or 1,000 listens on your very first episode within a week. It's usually not how it's going to go. You'll get a couple here and there. Tell your friends and family, obviously, and they'll help get the listens up. But essentially, the more people listen to it, the more it gets in front of other people, so on and so forth. That's the initial way of how things grow. But don't expect big numbers right off the start. It's just not going to happen, especially if you have a podcast, and we'll talk about it, where it's a name that's similar to a bunch of other ones, or it's not a subject matter that's very interesting to a lot of people. It all depends. There's a ton of variables and factors that determine how fast a podcast is going to grow. So one of the ways that you can build an audience is social media. So obviously you should have a social media for your podcast specific just to the podcast. So for instance, I have my own social media. And then our show's called Botched Podcast. That has its own social media. I also write comics. Those have their own social media. Everything should have its own social media. Everything should have its own email as well. The show should have an email because if people want to reach out, ask questions, communicate with you, email is a good way to do it. It's very safe. You don't have to worry about any sort of weird stuff going on. Email is great. Highly recommend doing that. Build a website. That can be a little bit more complicated. You don't have to do it, especially in this day and age, but it's always a nice little extra to have for the show, especially if people are trying to find you. As far as social media specifically goes, there's a class that I had taken a few years back, and one of the things that they taught, and I found it does work actually pretty well, is something called targeted social media interaction. So what that is, so if you, let's say you have a podcast and you build a social media account specifically for that podcast. Now you may think maybe I should just be promoting my show constantly nonstop on social media. Yeah, you should be doing that at least once a week when your episodes come out. However, the targeted social media is not about constantly posting. What it's about is, or promoting yourself, it's more interacting with other people that you're trying to get to listen to the show, but not actually promoting your show. So what I mean by that is, so let's say you have a D&D podcast. You go to D&D forums or, whatever groups on Facebook or, whatever pages on Instagram or TikTok that have to do with D&D stuff. And on your show account, you'll make comments or, share memes or GIFs or whatever it is, not even mentioning your podcast, just interacting like you normally would for 10, 15, 20 minutes a day and just doing that. And what'll happen is, especially if you have an engaging comment or if you're talking back and forth with people, they'll see your show title because that's the social media account. And then they'll click on your profile and they'll go and see, oh, they have a show, they have a podcast. Okay, I'll go listen to that. And it's surprising actually how well that works. It works a lot better than just every, Monday or Tuesday. Hey, the episode's live. This is what it's about. Here's a clip of it. Yada, yada, yada. The targeted social media interaction actually works really, really well as a way to grow an audience, but it's something that you have to sort of keep, again, consistency is key. You have to keep doing it every week, every day, couple minutes. You don't have to spend a lot of time on it. Like I said, 10, 15 minutes a day, something like that. Which is why if you could get somebody who's really good with social media to just do it for you, I highly recommend that. And I'm still trying to find that somebody who will do it for me because I'm not very good at social media personally. Another way to grow the audience, as we've talked about before, is having a quality show. Now, this could be content-wise or audio-wise, but again, if you have a show that's not engaging to listen to or doesn't sound very good, it's more likely that people will tune out or switch to something else in the meantime. Another way to get your show out there is to go to local conventions. Small ones, big ones, doesn't really, I would recommend probably more smaller conventions than bigger conventions. But I've seen podcasts, they'll get a table set up. They'll have a little bit of advertising there on the table in terms of like their logo or whatever it is. And they'll have stickers or bookmarks or buttons, whatever it is to hand out. And then they'll just sort of talk to people at the show. And people will come by the table and you'll just interact with people normally. And it's another way to sort of get your show out there for people to hear it. Another thing you can do, which is really, really good, it's a lot of fun, I highly recommend it, is cross promotion with other podcasts. So this could be other podcasts that are in the same sort of genre you're in. So for instance, for us, it would be D&D podcasts. Like I could go talk to other D&D podcasts. You could go talk to other podcasts too. It could be horror podcasts, comedy podcasts, whatever it is. And you can try and just sort of reach out through social media or email or whatever, and just sort of have a dialogue back and forth and talk about cross promoting. Now that can look like a couple of different things. You can have somebody from another show on your show. You can have, you could go on somebody else's show and then sort of promote that in the episodes. You can have an ad for their podcast in your episode that you record. I know for us, we'll have different shows record the introduction for our podcast, and then I'll record a plug for their show to follow right after that. And that's a really good, very easy way to do cross promotion. Another way is, I forget the exact term, but essentially it's posting episodes in each other's RSS feed. RSS feed is essentially where you post your episode and then it goes out to iTunes and Spotify and all that jazz. Every podcast has an RSS feed that's specific to it. So if you wanted to cross promote, what you could do is you could have one of their episodes and put it on your RSS feed, and then they could take one of your episodes and stick it on their RSS feed. So that way their listeners are getting to hear your stuff and your listeners are getting to hear their stuff. Again, most times with podcasts, you'll find that people are very nice and very friendly and likely to answer questions, or reach out, or do cross promotion. Sometimes you'll get like bigger fish. Like I wouldn't go reaching out to Joe Rogan's podcast and be like, "Hey, you want to do some cross promotion?" Chances are that probably he's not going to ever respond to you. Just the sort of the nature of the beast, so to speak. Another thing you could do to build an audience is called SEO. SEO is basically the background workings of the internet and everything else. It's everything that determines, the searchability of your podcast. Like if you go to Google and you type in Botched podcast, we are the first thing that pops up. Not the podcast that's based off of Botched, the TV show. And that's over time, having good SEO, your show notes, your hashtags, all that stuff, having a website, having social medias, having an email, all that helps build SEO, and having a specific show title. So that way, if somebody looks for it, boom, you pop right up there on the list. That's part of SEO. So it just makes it so you're more searchable. You're easier to find, essentially. Well, excuse me. It's all that dust. Does anybody have any questions before I move on to the next topic?
Hey, Dennis.
Yes.
I actually got something.
Sure.
That soundboard, the mixer or soundboard that you had, the one that you actually used, the higher end one.
Yeah, the Roadcaster.
Could you send me that? I actually really, really like that one compared to my Go XLR that I use right now.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no problem.
I
They
know
have different size ones too.
Sidetracked. I know it's completely. I just didn't want to forget about it. I just was
No,
thinking
no,
about it.
no.
I was like,
No,
wait,
yeah,
I didn't want to interrupt.
Yeah, no worries. Write it down so I don't forget. Anybody else have any questions before we move on to the next thing? Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about are recording fundamentals. So essentially, this is just like sort of rules and tips for recording to make your life easier, both on the front end and the back end of doing a podcast. So depending on the type of microphone you have, that will depend on where the mic needs to be in relation to you. So for instance, this microphone, you should be within 6 inches. Most microphones, you should be within 6 inches. However, the further away I get from the microphone, the less and less you can hear me, and the more far, it just doesn't sound as good. You have to be very close to it. With a Yeti microphone, you have to be very cognizant of the settings that you have it on. On the back of that microphone, there's a dial to change the type of settings. That's a microphone that sort of stands up. And depending on the settings, it could be, for you and another person, it could be you and 4 other people. If you have it on the wrong setting and you go to use it, it's not going to sound as good. Most of the time, the Yetis, you have to talk into the sides of them. So if you turn it and talk to it like I'm talking into my microphone, you're not going to hear yourself very well because you're in one of the dead zones of that microphone. So when you get a microphone or use a microphone, you should be aware of where you need to be in relation to that microphone. I think for the microphones that are slightly higher scale than this, like what specifically what Joe Rogan uses, you have to be like right here with the microphone. You have to be very, very close to the mic. Or as we say in the business, you have to eat the mic, basically, or it's not going to pick up your audio very well at all. If you want to reduce the plosives, those are the P sounds that I talked about before. You can either do this one of 2 ways. You can get a pop filter like we talked about before, one of these guys, or you can turn the microphone. This is going to be hard because of the camera, but essentially, so like I am over here talking. My mouth is still close enough to the mic that it can hear me, but my mouth is not pointed directly at the microphone. So the P is not hitting directly into the mic. So this is another way around it, where you're understanding that the sound, like the microphone is pointed where the sound is coming from, but not where the air is shooting out of your mouth. So that's another way to sort of get around that little issue. I'm having trouble here turning this and not turning my camera, so I'm all cockeyed. There we go. When you're recording, and it's not the easiest thing in the universe to do, and it's definitely something you have to practice over time, avoid filler words if you can. Like, verbal tics. These are difficult because they are essentially filler words. It's you filling air while you try and think of something to say. Most of the time, if I'm saying or or like, it's because I'm in the middle of a thought and I forgot the next word. So and then it goes from there. Most time on podcasts, you're going to end up editing those out. So if you want to make your life easier, try and sort of be cognizant of yourself saying it to limit that when you're speaking. And this is for all types of speaking, even public speaking. If you're giving speeches, narrating, anything in terms of anything related to that, avoid the filler words. People who use it like a comma, where like every single sentence has like 4 or 5 ums, that will start to grate on people really fast. So the easiest way to avoid that is just to sort of teach yourself to recognize, okay, this is my verbal tic. I say this particular word way too much. I need to reduce myself saying that. This one's kind of an obvious one, I guess, but sit up straight. For whatever reason, your posture does actually make a difference on the audio quality. If you're slumped over like this and talking, it just doesn't sound quite as good because for whatever reason, sitting up straight and talking into the microphone or the camera just sounds better. This is one that I do not follow very well and did not follow for this particular instance either. Don't eat or drink dairy for at least 30 minutes before recording. Why? Phlegm. The most simple excuse. You'll be constantly clearing your throat. It'll be more difficult to speak. I'll tell you this story. I go to DragonCon every year. I do a lot of panels at DragonCon. If you're not familiar with it, it's a big giant convention that's down in Atlanta, Georgia, for literally anything nerdy that you could possibly imagine. It's like 100,000 people. And I found out 5 minutes before one of the panels I was doing that I was moderating the panel on like voiceover or voice acting. And at that point, I hadn't even really done a whole lot of that stuff yet. So I was like, oh, okay. So essentially what it turned into, there was this, I think he did Overwatch characters, if memory serves me correctly. But he worked for Blizzard, and he was the professional voice actor, and he would tell you not to do certain things. And then I would say, yeah, don't do what I do, because it's dumb. So he would say, don't eat or drink dairy for 30 minutes. I would say, yeah, don't eat an entire pizza right before you're about to record. And someone else was like, well, you don't have to eat a whole pizza. I said, don't eat a whole pizza. That's what I said. Don't do what I do. What I did was eat an entire pizza. Don't do that. Don't eat any pizza right before you record. Don't drink milk. In fact, the best things to have on hand would be water, hot tea, things with honey and lemon, stuff like that. That helps sort of your vocal cords, especially if you're going to be talking for a long time all at once. Oh, my next point, have plenty of water on hand. But don't drink right next to the microphone while you're recording. Like, don't go in there like that. It'll be annoying and people will hate it. And you'll drive everyone crazy. Don't do that. Have your microphone set up where you aren't going to touch or hit it. So if you are somebody who talks with their hands a whole lot, you don't want to have your microphone over here right where your hand's going to be, so you're constantly hitting it or whapping it, because you'll notice that any sort of like touching of the boom arm or the microphone itself will generate a sound, and it'll come through your recording, as well as just your listeners will be able to hear all that. If you make a mistake, and this is more for if you're doing a podcast that'll have a lot of editing, or if you're doing narration or anything like that, if you make a mistake, and this isn't live recorded or going straight to tape, stop what you're doing, take a quick pause, and then restart the closest sentence that makes sense to make editing easier. There's no point to just bumble your way through a bunch of words and then have to fix it in post. It'll be a lot more difficult as opposed to just stopping, starting over the sentence, and going from there. Trust me, it will make your life so much easier. Silence your phone and any devices that make noises during the recording. I mean, that might be obvious. But again, any noises that pop up in the room are going to pop up in your microphone, and nobody wants to hear that. Although sometimes it is fun to rag on your friends if, their phone goes off and you've been doing this for 8 years and they should know to turn their phone off and it goes off in the middle of the recording, because then you get to, bust their chops for about 5-10 minutes. Make sure your recording software is set up properly, and we will be talking about Audacity in a little bit. As far as editing goes, but just make sure that it's set up properly, because I cannot tell you how many times, and we've had this recently, where we will go to record and somebody, could be us, could be somebody else, didn't check to see what microphone is set up in the recording device. So they just hit record. It could be the camera microphone, could be some other, like for instance, on this computer, for some reason, sometimes it'll switch over to the Oculus, which isn't on, and it's in a totally different section of the house. And I do not know why it would randomly pick the Oculus to record from. Not that it's picking up anything anyways. So be very careful of the device that's being recorded, because it could ruin your audio. We did a podcast where we had a special guest on, and she doesn't do a ton of podcasts, and she forgot to check her audio, and it was recording from a device that didn't actually record any audio. So her audio for the 3 hours that we recorded wasn't there, and we couldn't fix it. So what she ended up doing, I think, was listening to everybody else's audio and trying to dub her lines by, record them after the fact, which is so tedious. I don't even want to think about how ridiculous that would have been. So make your life easier. Again, make sure your recording device is set to the appropriate thing. Make sure your audio levels are correct. Again, in your editing software, I'll show you that, where making sure that everything looks like it's supposed to look and acting like it's supposed to act. And then, of course, this might be the most obvious. Once you hit record, make sure it's actually recording, that there's little sound waves and things like that to be like, oh, yeah, no, there is audio actually going in there. Because you'll be surprised sometimes. Again, if it's not set to anything, it might not be in there. This one is specifically about editing, but when you go to do a podcast, record yourself saying absolutely nothing for the first 5 seconds of your podcast episode. This is to help with the editing process. And again, we'll talk about it in a bit, but about removing the background noise of your room to an extent. Obviously, if you've got like a train going by, it's not going to get that. It's too loud, but some subtle fan noises or other things that might be in the background, this helps cut that out. And then last, ensure that you save your files when you're finished, so that way you don't lose anything that you recorded. Those are all the little tips before I get into actually talking about editing. But does anybody have any questions before I give you your first activity to work on? Nope. Okay. So here's the activity that I would like you to work on. I want you.
We have a question. Sorry, I
Okay.
just had to
Sure.
unmute us. Go
No
ahead.
worries. No worries. What can I do for you?
So my question is, like, what will we be using to do the thing?
To record a podcast?
Yeah.
So you guys will probably, now we're not going to record a podcast here in the session, but you could probably use the iPad or a telephone or something like that. It depends on what you have access to. Most of the time, the most readily available thing you'll have to you is your iPad that you have there in front of you, or a telephone if you have a cell phone or something like that.
Thanks.
Yep, no problem. So the exercise that I want to have you guys do is I want you to plan a podcast. I want you to think about all of the things that we talked about, and I can, jot down some basics in terms of the specifics. But, I want you to think about, okay, what kind of podcast is it going to be? What's the style of podcast that we're going to do? Who's going to do what job on the podcast? Who's going to be involved in it? How often are we going to release the podcast? Who's going to edit the podcast? Does it even need to be edited? Where are we going to send it? All of the different ins and outs of making just basic stuff. It doesn't have to be super, super crazy. But I would just like to see what you guys come up with in terms of, if you wanted to make a podcast, what would you do? How would you plan it out? So let's take the next, 10, 15 minutes and just plan out a podcast. And if anybody has any questions in the meantime, let me know. So let's say 11:45. All righty. Does everybody have an idea of what they want their podcast to be? And does anybody want to share their podcast idea? All righty. I see Blue Shirt has their hand up. I'm not sure if the other libraries don't have camera on. I can't see hands if they're up.
Go ahead, Bree.
So like if I was gonna make a podcast, it's gonna be like if I like make a video game, I would make it so it would tell about how like my video game doing and it would tell how everything works and like all the new updates.
Okay. So you're making your own video game and the podcast would be all about that video game.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a good idea. I've seen that. I've seen quite a few, especially independent game studios do that. I'm trying to think of, I think one's called Ashes of Creation, which is like an MMORPG, and they do that, where, they'll put out weekly updates like, hey, this is where the game is right now in development and stuff like that. That's a fun idea. How often would you put them out? Would you put them out every week or
Bree didn't come back. Here's the question.
run away?
I've been put it out maybe at least 4 times every month.
Okay.
Once a week because it's gonna have like a lot of updates and stuff. It's always gonna be like adding stuff and there's always gonna be like new content and things.
Okay. Are you going to have a team or are you going to be all by yourself making this podcast?
I'm gonna do it with the team because I have no
Okay.
idea how to do
That's fair. Anybody else?
You want to share?
what? Mine is a game. Mine updates every 1 week.
Okay.
Mine updates every 7 days.
Okay.
And I have a very weird character that you can only get until 1 week.
Okay. And then Miss at CLOH. I'm not sure if there's a specific way I'm supposed to say that or not,
Yep.
but I see you have your hand up.
Yep. All right, Dyson. You could just say what you wanted it to be about.
It's about Five Nights at Freddy's.
Okay, so is it about like you playing the game or is it just like tips and tricks? Like what kind of podcast?
Just like stuff. Just like stuff.
Okay.
So more so
Like what is this franchise?
Okay.
PC version, fan games.
So
Okay.
it's basically like the history of Five Nights at Freddy's, starting
Okay.
when it was released all the way down to the movie.
Yep.
All right, so like an in-depth, like everything you want to know about Five Nights at Freddy's.
Yeah.
That sounds cool. How often would you want to put that out?
Well, there's only gonna be like 10.
Oh, okay.
We kind of stopped it at 10, so you could do
Okay.
like every other week maybe. So it would probably
Okay.
take a lot of research.
And then would you be doing this all by yourself? Would you have other people, doing the show with you?
There would be someone else. My other person who's here didn't want to be on camera, so we'd have
Okay.
at least 2
Okay.
people, and that would be supervising.
Yeah,
Awesome.
But if I, oh wait, I have a camcorder at my house,
Okay.
so maybe.
Okay. Anybody else want to share their podcast? I just now noticed that says Shippensburg Public Library. That's where I graduated college, Shippensburg University. Small world. Anybody else want to share their podcast? No? Okay. I don't know about any of the other ones that currently are muted, like Neva, Klein, Madeline, Maria. Not sure if anybody else wants to share or not. If not, that's totally fine. I liked all those ideas. Those are fun. I've seen a few like that. I listened to a few myself, so that's cool. I've never actually gotten into Five Nights at Freddy's, so I don't know anything about it. So I'd be interested in that podcast because I don't know anything about it. There was one other thing that I wanted to talk about or add to the to planning your podcast out that I forgot to mention, and that's coming up with an elevator pitch. So if you don't know what an elevator pitch is, an elevator pitch is essentially a few sentences explaining what your podcast is about in the most interesting and enticing way to get somebody interested in listening. So, for instance, our elevator pitch for the podcast is, or at least the way I describe it to people, is it is a D&D podcast, or no, it's a improv comedy show draped in the loose skin of Dungeons and Dragons with a little bit of drinking involved, set in the SCP universe. So like that's like one sentence. It tells people exactly what it is and what it's about, and if you're into it or not into it. So that is everything that you need to know. Elevator pitches are great for getting people on board with an idea, whether it be social media or if you're trying to get somebody outside involved that might be interested in, helping with the podcast or listening to the podcast or anything. And that's for lots of walks of life. Getting into a professional career, even if it's not podcasting, the job that I'm in, they have classes specifically on doing elevator pitches about yourself, making an elevator pitch to sell yourself as like, hey, this is why I'm really good for this or that. Elevator pitches for that. Elevator pitches for movies, for video games, for TV shows. Like if you were to think about Five Nights at Freddy's, for instance, you could probably come up with a really good elevator pitch, short, sweet, to the point, to tell me what that game is, why it's awesome, in like just a couple of sentences that might entice me to checking out the game or checking out the podcast that you were planning on doing. There are different types of things you'd use an elevator pitch for, but it is a really useful tool that you'll use throughout your life for, any facet of life. So let's get into talking about editing a podcast. So the first thing I want to talk about with editing a podcast is what I call the brainworm. So when you start to edit a podcast, you will develop what I lovingly refer to as the brainworm. The brainworm is basically when you start to edit a podcast, you start to listen for specific things that you're looking for. Tongue clicks, mouth noises, different things like that. And the reason I call it a brainworm is once you have taught yourself to listen for those things, you can't unhear them. So then when you're starting to listen to other things, you will hear that stuff and it'll make you a little bit crazy. Not too crazy, but a little bit crazy. You'll hear the ums, the breaths, the tongue clicks, especially if you edit a lot, because that's what your brain has been trained to listen for, to cut out. So you're going to hear those things and ask yourself, why didn't they cut those out? We do corporate training all the time at my company. And like I said, I do a lot of audio editing. And when I have to take corporate training and I can tell that they have not edited the audio at all, where I can hear the background noise, I can hear, people talking, mouth noises, all that stuff, it will literally start to make my eye twitch a little bit because I'm like, why? Just give it to me. Let me fix this for you. I will make it better. Please just don't make me listen to this. So that is what I call the brainworm. And if you start to edit a podcast, you will most likely develop this brainworm because you will hear and see things that you don't normally pay any attention to, but you will start to once you start doing that. And this is every human being I've ever taught to audio edit. Every single person I work with says the same thing. I will show them a track of audio. It'll look like there's nothing on that track whatsoever in the space. But I know that there is like mouth noise in there and it's like very quick and it's very subtle and they don't hear it. And then the next time I talk to them, they talk about that's all they hear now everywhere. So now they know where it is and they can spot it because you've trained your brain to sort of get used to that. And like I said before, editing is very, very tedious. So it is something that is like very time consuming. It's very detail oriented. It's something that takes a lot of time, but it is a useful skill to have in your cap for the rest of your life. To edit audio, I highly recommend getting headphones. They don't have to be super expensive headphones or anything like that, like $12, something like that. It will make your life easier. You can use earbuds, but I don't recommend them. For whatever reason, it's easier to pick up on subtle sounds and little things that you might otherwise miss if you have headphones as opposed to earbuds. There are various tools that you can use to edit audio, one of which we're going to talk about in a little bit, and I'll show you a couple things for. You can use paid or free tools. The paid tools include things like Adobe Audition or a program called Reaper. A lot of people in podcasting that I know really like Reaper. But again, that's a paid tool. Then there are free tools. On your iPads, you have a recording app called GarageBand. If you only have the iPad to record with, I highly recommend probably giving GarageBand a try. It's not the best app. It's not very good for a lot of things or audio editing, but it's free and it's on all the iPads. If you're using a computer, I recommend Audacity. I use Audacity. It's the first thing that I learned to use when I started editing our podcast, when I taught myself how to do everything from scratch. It is the free option, and it's pretty easy to use and learn. I used to describe the difference between Audacity and Adobe Audition as a crowbar versus a scalpel. Both of them can technically get the job done, but one is much more fine-tuned and needs a lot more experience and understanding of how to use it, whereas the other one is much more blunt, and yes, it'll get the job done. It's a lot easier to use. Almost anybody can use it. The one thing that I will say that I use Adobe Audition for is music, but that's a paid program, so if you don't have access to it, you don't really have to worry about it. But when you're doing music, sometimes you might have to loop your music, and Adobe Audition has a really cool thing where you can plug in a song and then tell it how long you want that song to be, and it will automatically adjust the length of the song seamlessly. You won't even notice, to fit the length of what you want it to be. I use it a lot for my corporate videos where you have to have your background music for a video. Some videos are 3 minutes, some 5, 8 minutes, something like that. So I'll plug it into Audition, tell it how long I want it to be, and within like plus or minus 5 seconds, it'll give me the length of audio that I need that I can put into a video, as opposed to tediously doing it yourself by hand like you would have to in Audacity. So at this point, I want to talk about Audacity. So I'm going to pull it up. I'm going to show it to everybody to give you an idea what it looks like, or we'll go through like a real basic rundown of what it is and how it works. Let me pull it up here. So again, this would be if you are doing this on your computer. This is the easiest way to record and edit your audio if you're doing a podcast or anything like that. So let me give you a real basic dime tour of this particular program. Most of what you're going to be using is in this toolbar here. And can everybody see me? Can you see my screen or no? Okay, just wanted to make sure. So obviously over here, you've got your recording functions. So these options over here on the left, the pause, the play, the stop, the skip, and whatnot, that's not really going to do anything until you've already recorded something. Once you hit the red button, you will see something pop up down here, and that will be your recording track. I'll show that to you in a second. Over here are some other tools. You don't really need to worry about these. You can leave them on the default. Zooming in, zooming out, that's important. But other than that, again, don't really need to worry about too much else over here. Before, I had mentioned make sure that your device is set to the right microphone. Audio setup is where you want to go for that. Playback device is your like the speaker where it's going to be playing. It's going to be playing through your headphones, your earbuds, the computer speakers, whatever it is. In my instance, again, I don't know why it picks this, why it's even there, but the Oculus virtual audio device, it's in there. So just make sure that's set to the right thing that you're trying to listen to. Your recording device is what you're going to be recording into. In my instance, I have it on the Rodecaster Pro Stereo. That's my soundboard that I have set up. That's what I want to have it on. If you had only a camera microphone, you'd want to make sure it was set to that. If you had some other sort of microphone that's plugged into your computer or wherever else, you want to make sure that you have it set to that. So make sure that you have that set, and you should be good. Up here, this is what we call the monitor. So this will let you monitor your recording levels. To explain this bar in about as basic as I can, the minus side is lower. The 0 is the highest it could possibly go. You want to be around between minus 18 to minus 6. Anything below that, it's harder to hear. People aren't going to hear it. Anything above that is what we're going to call a peak. A peak and we might see it here in the audio. It'll turn into a red line. That is an uncomfortable sound that's too loud, and if somebody's listening, it's going to sound odd. You've hit the peak of the audio level, and at that point, you've gone above it or just hit it, and it's going to make a really uncomfortable, nasty sound that no one's going to like. So we want to avoid those whenever possible. But you can adjust your bar. So this will adjust what we call the gain, which is like the volume, but it's the volume for everything. It's everything your microphone's picking up, it's going to pick it up. So it's going to pick up your voice, and it's going to pick up the background noise. It's all the volume. So once we have that all set up, we will hit the record button. And as you can see, a few things start to happen. Here we have our audio bar. You'll see these little blue lines. This will be the easiest way to tell if you're actually recording any audio, because if there is nothing going on in here, that means you're not recording anything. So it's a pretty easy way to tell if your microphone's not working properly. Up here is that monitor I was talking about. So if you see, it's in the green. The yellow is good because it's loud, but it's not too loud. And if I crank this bar up here a little bit more, you'll notice that it starts to turn orange and it starts to turn red. And over here, you'll see that these lines get closer and closer to the top. And that's because that is what's called a peak. If somebody were to listen to that, it's going to be an uncomfortable sound. So for this purpose, I'm going to stop. So let's go through some of the other tools that's in here. Most of what you're going to use, the most important thing, obviously, is to save. You want to save your project right away as soon as you're finished recording. And when you start to edit your project, you want to make a copy of it. Why? If something happens to what you're working on, the audio or otherwise, and you don't have a copy, you basically have nothing to work from. Think about it from a video game standpoint. You don't usually just have one save file. You usually have some backups, because let's say your save file becomes corrupted, or let's say you're playing Fallout or something like that, where you make a choice and you don't like the choice. And you're like, crap, I want to go back and make a different choice. Use the backup. Same thing with this. Let's say you edited to a certain point and you accidentally deleted something that you didn't want to, and you can't get it back for whatever reason. If you have a backup, you can go back to a previous version and then start over or start from a specific spot. That's why saving a backup, very important. I highly recommend it in case something happens. And then when you actually want to send your audio out, like, I'm done editing the podcast. It's now ready for me to upload onto the web and then have it go out to Spotify and iTunes and all that stuff, you will hit export audio. You'll name it whatever you want to name it. You'll put it wherever you want to put it in terms of the folder. And then the format you want to use is MP3. Yours might default to a WAV file. A WAV file is another type of audio file, but it's huge. It's a really, really big file, and it'll take you forever to export it. It'll take you forever to stick it onto a website. Very slow. The quality is the highest, but it's very slow. I do not recommend it. So what we do is we go with MP3. And then down here, you can leave this on stereo because that just means it's going through both ears. So that's good. Sample rate, leave that at the default. And then there's an option here called bit rate mode. I recommend setting it to constant. And then the reason for that is it'll change the options you have as far as quality goes. Quality is what it sounds like. It's how good the quality of whatever audio you're exporting is going to be. So there is like a minimum that you don't want to go below, and there's a maximum you don't want to go above, because again, your audio files are going to get too big. What I find the sweet spot is about 160 to 192 kilobytes per second. That will allow you to have a smaller file size while not sacrificing much or any audio quality. If you absolutely have a small file that you want to have like a higher quality of, like if you're doing a narration of some sort for a podcast or like an audiobook, you can go up to 224. Just make sure that it's not too long. And then once that's all done, you'll click the export button. And you'll see this little bar pop up on your screen, and it'll just tell you that it's exporting. You just wait until it's done, and then it'll spit out the audio file, whatever you name it, wherever you decided to save it. And then you can use it for podcasting or, putting up in your RSS feed and all that jazz. So as far as tools. I'm going to tell you just a few of the most useful tools that I would recommend you use on every single instance of doing a podcast, and I'll tell you the order of operations in which to do it. So the first thing you want to do is select all of your audio. Easiest way to do that would be to double click inside the track and it'll make everything white. Or over on the left-hand side, there's this little bar and you can click in there once and it'll do the same thing. It'll highlight the whole thing. First thing you'll do is you'll go to Effect and you'll go to Amplify. Amplify increases the volume of everything in your audio. Again, the background noise and your voice and all that stuff. But you want to make sure that your audio is the highest level it can go without peaking, as I talked about before. So if you click on Amplify, it'll tell you. All right. So mine says negative, which means I've already peaked because I turned up the gain on that on purpose. So normally it probably shouldn't be a negative number. But if it is a negative number, we don't have to worry about this step. We'll look at it and be like, the button down here that says allow clipping, that means it'll allow it to peak, which you don't want it to do. So there's literally no reason to ever allow clipping. Whatever number you set it to, when you're done, you hit apply and it'll put that across the entire selected bar and that'll increase your volume. Or if you make it a minus, it'll decrease the volume on everything. Once you've done that, I mentioned before that at the start of a recording, you want to record 5 seconds of not saying anything. And the reason for that is what we call noise reduction. That is essentially capturing the noise that's in your background wherever you're recording, and then we filter that out of your audio so it sounds much better. I didn't record 5 seconds in here because I didn't think about it ahead of time when I hit the record button. I'm just talking stream of conscious. But let's just pretend that this is 5 seconds. We highlight our little section. So it's this white section that's right here. We'll go up to Effect, and then we will go to Noise Reduction. Now, yours might look a little different if this is a newer version of Audacity, which I updated mine yesterday, but this looks like the old version. So I'm not sure why it did that, but it is what it is. So yours might be, it might say like amplification and noise reduction or something like that. But if you click on noise reduction, it'll give you this box. In either version, it'll look the same once you actually click on the option. Get noise profile, and then it'll have some other stuff down here. But the first time you open it, the OK button will be grayed out. And the reason is it doesn't know what to do. So get noise profile, what it will do is it will take this little section that I've highlighted and it'll use that as a sample. So essentially what we're doing by clicking on get noise profile, it creates a sample of the background noise that we've selected. And then if we go back to Effect and click on noise reduction, now you see that this section does have an OK button. So what it does, it takes that selection that we've made and it filters it out of all of your audio. So if there's a like a hum or a buzz or anything like that, it will take it and it'll cut it out of the whole audio that you've recorded. To give you a little, it's great, but not perfect sort of story. So I once wanted to test the limit of this. We had cheaper microphones and it was really, really hot in the house. So we had an air conditioner running and it was really, really loud. So I said, okay, let's see what happens if I make a recording. Can I filter out the air conditioner noise? And the quick answer is yes, you can. However, what happens is it takes that air conditioner noise. So the more noise you have, it'll take it, it'll make that sample and it will cut it out of all your audio. But the louder your background is, it will then sort of mess with the rest of the audio. So even though we are speaking normally, we'll sound like we're robots or we'll sound like we're in a different room or made of tin or something like that, where by taking out that loud buzzing noise throughout the entirety of the audio, it changes the rest of your audio and makes it worse. But once you've made your selection, you hit OK, it'll filter everything out for you. The next tool I would use is called compressor. So what you do for this is you would highlight your whole track again, go to Effect, click on compressor. What this does, it looks through your entire audio track. It looks for your peaks, the highest points, and then it shrinks them so that it makes it all uniform and not too high. So you won't peak anymore. It'll be down low. And if you want to copy the settings, you're more than welcome to on any of the ones before. I forgot to mention that before. But the one option I really recommend making sure is unchecked is makeup gain for 0 decibels after compressing. Make sure that is not checked. For whatever reason, it gets real squirrely. But once you have your options set in here, click apply. And if you even watch on the screen in the background, you'll notice some of these sections that are a little peakier, they'll shrink. So you see, it shrunk down everything. So now it's all roughly about the same height, and there's not anything that's over a certain height. So nothing will peak anymore. It'll all be lower. Those are the basic functions that you can basically do for any type of podcast. There are some other ones that are obviously come in handy. Fade in, essentially that whatever selection you make, the first part of your selection starts at 0 in terms of sound. It's silent. And then the end of your selection puts it up to 100% of whatever it was originally. Fade out is the opposite. So it starts at the loudest and ends at 0. It's good for, coming into something and going out something. Fade in, fade out can be very useful. The other the other tool I want to talk about that'll make your life easier when it comes to audio editing. If you need to make a change to anything, crossfade clips. What this does is, whatever your selection is, it takes 50-50. So if you have 1 second of audio selected, it'll make it a half a second long. And it basically just crunches your audio together 50-50, fade in, fade out, fade in, fade out, and it'll just mix them together. And this is really good if you're making cuts near words, because sometimes it won't have a clean finish to it, and this will let you sort of get in, get out, and it'll sound more natural. These are all tools that you sort of have to learn how to use and play around with, but those are the most important ones. There's not even any settings you have to do for crossfade clips. You just highlight your selection, click the button, that's it. And there are a ton of other tools that you can use. Obviously, if you look in here, your pitch, so you can sound higher or lower, echo, adding echo to things, reverb, so it sounds like you're in a room. There's all kinds of different tools in here that are really fun. And there's lots of different tutorials and guides on the internet that you can use to sort of go through that stuff. Once you have everything edited, like I said, you'll save it, export it, all that jazz. Just double checking. So, as I said, there's a few editing tips, especially one. When you're editing audio, the best thing I can recommend that you do when you're editing audio is to go back. Let's say you make an edit of you cut out a spot or something like that. And to cut things out, it's the same tools that you use for everything else. Control C, Control X, Control V, that sort of stuff to cut, paste, all that jazz. If you cut something out, if you're making edits, always go back just a couple of seconds before you made your edit and then listen through to make sure it sounds right. The way I know if it's a good edit is if you cannot tell that there was an edit there. If it just sounds totally natural, it just goes right through. If nobody has any idea that you made an edit, you have made a successful edit. That's the goal, to basically get in and get out without any footprints or fingerprints or anything like that. Also, when you're editing, if you want to tighten up a podcast, let's say, so for instance, with my show, we do a D&D audio drama kind of thing. Sometimes there'll be long pauses where they're thinking about how do they want to solve a puzzle, because math is not their strong suit. So how do we make that not so boring for listeners? Cut out the long silences. If it's more than a second and a half is usually my rule, I will chop it down to about a second and a half, so it's not too long. So those are the main sort of tips as far as actual editing goes. And depending on the type of show you do, you also want to add an intro or an outro. This is something that you can either do while you're doing your show, or you can do it ahead of time and then add it later. So the intro for your podcast should be short, sweet, to the point. Tells everybody what they need to know about your show or whatever's coming up in that episode, and then goes into things. It can be static in terms of it's the same every time, so you can record it once and then just plop it into each of your episodes. That's the easiest way to do it anyways. Or you can record it live on the spot. If like you're interviewing somebody and you want to give a brief, like, hey, this is what we're doing, this is what's going on this week, you could do it that way. An outro is a little different. An outro is telling people, where they can find you and your other hosts, where they can support you, if it's like Patreon or something like that, what your social medias are, what the email for the show is. If you want to read out iTunes reviews, you can do that. I know we do that. If you have patrons from Patreon, maybe one of your goals is, we'll read your names off at the end of the episodes. That's where people do that. You'll watch a lot of YouTube videos. Sometimes they'll do it. They'll say, I want to thank my patrons. And there's a whole list of names that scroll down. That's one way you can do it as well. So that's part of the outro. You want to add music as well to the intro and outro of your show. Obviously, that matches the theme of your show. Just make sure that you have permission to use that music. You can't just take, I don't know, your favorite Metallica song or your favorite, Miley Cyrus or Katy Perry or whatever. You can't just take whatever song you want and just plop it into a podcast. That's a big no-no. You have to get permission to use a song, or you have to go and find free to use music or no copyright music, as they say. You can do that on YouTube or other places. Motion Array is another place that you can use. And you take the music, and the way you ought to do it is it fades in, and then it will the volume will lower as the intro to your show begins, and then it'll fade out as the actual show starts, the meat and potatoes of the show. And then when you fade out, and then the outro of the show, the music should fade in. That's the cue that the show is ending. And it just sort of plays very subtly in the background. It's very low, very quiet. And then after you're done with your outro, the music can pick up a little bit and then fade out, and that's the end of the episode. And sometimes you can add things onto the end like stingers, which if you don't know what that is, it's like a blooper reel kind of a thing. When we're doing our show, I have to cut stuff out all the time. It just doesn't fit, or it's before we started recording, but it's funny. So I will, take a bit of it and just stick it on the end of the episode after the episode is over. So if anybody's actually listening the whole way through, they can hear the funny bits. As far as now your podcast is done, where do you release it? If there's video involved, obviously Twitch, YouTube, that sort of stuff. You guys probably already know about that. But if it's audio only, you can release that also on YouTube, but it usually also has to have some sort of video component. But what's recommended is that you put it someplace where all the other podcatchers will get it. Now, a podcatcher is essentially just anywhere that you can listen to podcasts. Excuse me. So like iTunes, Spotify, Google Music's not a thing anymore, but YouTube Music, stuff like that. Those are all podcatchers. There's a million of them out there. So the easiest way that I would recommend if you want to start doing a podcast and post your audio someplace where, you can create an RSS feed so it goes out on Spotify and iTunes and all that stuff would be Anchor. It's called Anchor. It's a program it's not even a program. It's a website that's made by Spotify specifically for podcasting. Now, when you make a profile on Anchor, you'll make an RSS feed. Like it'll set it all up there for you. And then you pick where you want it to go. Oh, I want it to go to iTunes. I want it to go to Spotify. Here. And then anywhere that has that RSS feed, when you post your audio to Anchor, it automatically sends it to each of the other places. So iTunes or Spotify. Like when I make my episodes, I don't have to post it on each one individually. You post it in one spot. It's called a hosting service, and then goes everywhere else for you. Anchor is the best because it's free. There are other ones that have better like statistics if you really want to track who's listening, where they're listening, stuff like that. But Anchor's free, and you can eventually generate a little bit of ad revenue later. As more and more people listen to your show, you make a little bit of money from it as well. And I know a few people who they have a big listenership. Like I have a friend who does various Nintendo podcasts, and he has a lot of listeners. And he says he makes a lot of money from ads every month, and he uses Anchor. Again, but that's dependent on how many people listen to your show. So if you only have if you're just starting off and you only have 20 people listening, probably not going to make very much, if any, money until you start to build your show up. But again, money shouldn't be your worry right away when you're, starting out a podcast or anything like that. You should also write out what are called show notes, which I mentioned before as part of SEO. These are notes that go into the description of the episode. And what this does is it essentially gives everybody a Cliff Notes sort of summary about what the episode is about without telling too much. And it'll also include like different hashtags and keywords that'll make your podcast more searchable if they're looking for it in Google or iTunes or things like that. So that's everything as far as audio goes. And I'll touch on the video stuff here real quick because I know we only have a few more minutes, and I did want to talk about keying out your green screen specifically on a computer, because researching this, I'm not actually sure if you can get rid of your green screen on your iPad version of Streamlabs. It might only be a computer only thing. And if I'm wrong, feel free to slap my hand for that. I just couldn't find it as I've been researching it anyways. But do we have any questions about podcasting before I show some of the video stuff?
All right, we've got a question here.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So, how did you get those, like, how did you get to record on the thing you were just using?
Say that again?
How did you get to record your voice on the thing you were just using?
So in Audacity, so I'll share it again real quick here. And again, Audacity would be something you would use on a computer. You wouldn't use this on your iPad. If you were going to use the iPad, I would recommend using something like GarageBand.
Yeah,
Though
right here.
Yeah.
Oh,
we
you have GarageBand up? All right, well, let me pull up GarageBand and look at it. Or you don't? What do you have?
Yeah, we do here at India Valley.
The audit.
You have Audacity?
Audacity, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it has to be on the computer. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. So in Audacity, up in this top bar, do you see the red button?
Yeah.
That is the record button.
Uh-huh.
So if you want to record something, just make sure that in your audio setup over here on this, where you can see that your recording device is set to whatever you want to record on. So a microphone or whatever it is that you want to record audio from. And then once that's set up, you'll click the red circle to record the audio.
Oh, so it's not showing up.
Will it automatic, if we have a microphone plugged in, would that automatically pick that up, or do we have to fiddle with the settings?
I would check to see if it's in the audio setup. Most of the time, if it's the only option, it will default. But if there are other options like a camera mic or something like that, or some other sort of like Bluetooth connected thing, it may try to connect to that instead. But if you click on, there should be like a little speaker icon that says audio setup with a little drop down arrow.
Yeah.
Try rescanning your device.
So if you click on that and then recording device, it should give you a list.
Yep, we got it.
Okay. So once that's set, you hit the record button and it'll record. And when you're done recording, you can click on the stop button and it'll stop.
Thanks.
No problem. Any other questions?
Hey, Dennis.
Yes.
We got a question for you.
Yeah.
So with Audacity, I don't personally use that, but I'm moving from Adobe over to, and I was thinking about using Audacity.
Okay.
Can you import files? So like since I stream instead, can I import my like I guess recorded the audio from the stream over to Audacity, or would I have to record through Audacity?
No, you can import audio. So in Audacity, in the file section, you can import instead of export.
Okay.
And you can just take whatever audio and plop it in there and it should work.
Okay.
If it's stereo, it'll give you 2 tracks. If it's mono, it'll give you 1 track. So it just depends on how it's set up.
Okay. I'll have to actually think about that for next week so I can actually talk about
Yeah, no
that.
problem. And before we leave, I did want to quickly just show how, if you have a green screen and you have Streamlabs set up on your computer, how you can green screen out that. So I'm going to share the setup for my show normally. So this is the setup for our basic stuff. We do, like I said, it's a comedy podcast and it's in the it's D&D, but it's set in the SCP universe. So obviously I don't have all the cameras built in because I can't have cameras on at the same time as I have in Zoom. But for instance, I just stuck this green folder here in front of my buddy Philip's camera to give you an idea of, how do you get rid of the green portions if you had a green screen back here? And it's called chroma key. So Once you have the scene that you want to select over here on the left, in the middle, you have your sources. This is where you'll have your pictures or your video or your cameras or, text, whatever it is, everything in the scene itself would be in sources. So for my particular instance, I believe, yes, video capture device 1, because I never label anything as I ought to, is Philips camera. So for me, I will right click on that and I will go to filters. When you hover over filters, a little pop-up will appear next to it and it'll say edit filters, copy filters, or paste filters. If you click on edit filters, a new pop-up appears. Now, I don't know if you can actually see this on my screen because we had some issues where pop-ups don't pop up even though it's part of the same program. But the box that pops up will be pretty bare bones. On the left-hand side is what you need to worry about. There'll be visual preset, which is set to none, and then there'll be add filter, plus add filter. You're going to click on that button, the plus add filter button. A new pop-up appears, and under filter type, you'll click on that. And what you're looking for is chroma key, CHROMA key. You click on that. And then once you've selected it, you'll hit add. Now, what you'll get, now that section that was bare bones will have some more information in it. And you can change the type of background. So if you had a blue background or something else, you can change the color. But essentially, you'll get a bunch of bars that you can drag around: similarity, smoothness, key color spill reduction, so on and so forth. You can play around with those settings so that it accurately gets what you want. So for instance, I would play with the settings until the folder disappears. So I'm going to mess around with these a little bit. Yeah, it's good enough for me. So I move that a little bit, and then I'm going to click close. So now if you look at
doing a thing where it's not showing.
I know.
I was going to say, is there an option to share your monitor instead of the program?
Let me see here. Stop share.
I just was wondering. I was trying not to interrupt since you're in a full on like.
Let's go with screen 1 and see what happens. All right, so we can see this. Let me remove the filter. Okay.
I think that's what we wanted.
Okay. So again,
All right, sorry about that. Go ahead.
No, it's fine. I'll right click on the video, the camera that I want to, be messing around with, the one that has the green screen, and I'll click on edit filters in the filters section. In this pop-up, I will click on add filter. And then in this pop-up, I will click on chroma key, CHROMA key, and click add. Now this section is filled out, and mess with these settings until it basically removes just the green color. You don't want it to remove anything else, just the green section. So for my purposes, I'm going to raise this up a little bit. That's pretty close. Because for me, the folder's not at a good angle and it's lit weird, so it is what it is. But so for instance, it has now removed the green from the background. So you can actually see behind the camera for, whatever's behind it, which is this Site 16 SCP site and all that stuff. So yeah, so it cuts that out. So that's how you chroma key. So if you had a green screen and let's say your background was, I don't know, a picture of Five Nights at Freddy's or a video of something playing, that's how you would do it. So it'll cut everything out except for whatever's not green. Keep in mind, don't wear green if you're doing that because you'll be a floating head or whatever it is. But that's essentially how you would chroma key out whatever it is you're trying to green screen. I believe that's right around the end. Does anybody have any questions before we wrap up? If not, I will turn it over to Micah.
No, that was pretty good. I mean, I'm glad that I know how to use green screens now. That's actually one thing that I never knew how to use, even after going to a magnet school in high school. So that's nice. But yeah, no, thank you for joining us today. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the